Finding out that someone you love and trust has deliberately sabotaged your birth control to trap you into a life you explicitly never wanted is the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart. It shatters your entire sense of reality and makes you question every decision you've ever made. So I'm a 33-year-old woman, and I've known since I was a teenager that I never wanted kids. It's not something I'm unsure about or think I might change my mind on. It's a fundamental part of who I am. And I've been very open and honest about this with every serious partner I've ever had, because I think it's one of those deal-breaker issues that needs to be addressed early. I met my now ex-partner, Brian, 4 years ago, and on our third date I brought up the kids conversation because I didn't want to waste anyone's time, and I told him very clearly that I was child-free by choice and that wasn't going to change, and if he wanted kids someday, then we should end things now before anyone got too invested. Brian told me he was totally on the same page, that he'd never really seen himself as a parent, and he was actually relieved to meet someone who felt the same way because so many people assume everyone wants kids eventually, and we bonded over being child-free and all the benefits that came with it, like freedom and flexibility and being able to travel and focus on our careers. We moved in together after about a year of dating and things were great. We'd have these conversations about all the things we wanted to do with our child-free lives, the trips we'd take, the hobbies we'd pursue, the nice things we could afford because we weren't spending money on raising children, and it really felt like we were on the same page about our future. I've been on birth control pills since I was 18 for both pregnancy prevention and to manage some medical issues, and I was very consistent about taking them every day at the same time. And Brian knew this, and we'd never had any pregnancy scares or issues in our entire relationship. About 8 months ago, I started feeling really off, like nauseous in the mornings and exhausted all the time, and my breasts were tender, and I thought maybe I had the flu or something, but after about a week of feeling terrible, I started to suspect something was wrong, and I took a pregnancy test just to rule it out, even though I couldn't understand how it would be possible since I was on birth control. The test was positive, and I absolutely freaked out. I took 3 more tests because I couldn't believe it, and they were all positive, and I was sitting on the bathroom floor having a panic attack because this was literally my worst nightmare coming true. I told Brian immediately and expected him to be just as shocked and upset as I was, but his reaction was weird. He seemed almost calm about it, and he hugged me and said we'd figure it out and everything would be okay. And I said, Brian, I don't want to figure it out. I want to schedule an abortion as soon as possible because I do not want to be pregnant and I do not want a child. He got really quiet and then said maybe we should think about this before making any quick decisions, and I told him there was nothing to think about. We were both child-free. This was an accident, and I needed to terminate the pregnancy as soon as possible. Brian started saying things like, maybe this was meant to be, and maybe we should consider keeping it since we were financially stable and in a committed relationship, and I looked at him like he'd grown a second head because this was completely contradicting everything we'd ever discussed about being child-free. I asked him point blank if he'd changed his mind about wanting kids, and he said he hadn't changed his mind exactly, but now that it was actually happening, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, and I told him that was not how this worked. You don't just accidentally fall into parenthood when you've spent years being adamantly child-free. We had a huge argument where Brian kept trying to convince me to at least think about it for a few days, and I kept saying there was nothing to think about because I knew with absolute certainty that I did not want to be a mother. And he accused me of being cold and not even considering the possibility that this could be a good thing. I told him he was welcome to feel however he wanted about the pregnancy, but my body and my choice were clear, and I was going to schedule an abortion, and he got really upset and left the apartment saying he needed time to think. While he was gone, I called my best friend Sarah because I was completely spiraling, and I was telling her about the positive pregnancy tests and how I couldn't understand how it happened since I was so careful with my birth control. And she asked if there was any chance someone could have tampered with my pills, and I said, no, that's crazy. But then I actually went and looked at my pill pack, and something seemed off. I keep my birth control in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, and when I really looked at the current pack, I noticed that some of the pills looked slightly different, like the color was a tiny bit off. And I got this sick feeling in my stomach and pulled out the pack to examine it more closely. I compared the pills to a backup pack I had, and some of them were definitely not the same. They were similar, but not identical. And I realized with absolute horror that someone had replaced some of my birth control pills with something else, probably sugar pills or placebos or just random pills that looked similar enough. I sat there trying to figure out who would have done this, and the only person who had access to my medicine cabinet and would have any reason to mess with my birth control was Brian, and I felt like I was going to be sick because surely my partner of 4 years who I loved and trusted wouldn't have deliberately sabotaged my birth control to get me pregnant. When Brian came back a few hours later, I confronted him with the pill pack and asked him to explain why some of my pills had been replaced, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He went pale and started stuttering and saying he didn't know what I was talking about, and I told him to stop lying because I could see the evidence right in front of me. He tried to deny it for a few more minutes, but I kept pushing, and finally he broke down and admitted that he'd replaced some of my birth control pills with fake ones over the past few months because he wanted us to have a baby, and he knew I'd never agree to it willingly, and I just sat there in complete shock, trying to process the fact that the person I loved had deliberately violated my bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. Brian started trying to justify it by saying he'd been feeling differently about kids for a while, and he didn't know how to bring it up because he knew how strongly I felt about being child-free. And he thought if I just got pregnant, maybe I'd change my mind once it was real. And he said he did it because he loved me and wanted to build a family with me. I told him that what he did wasn't love, it was reproductive coercion, and it was illegal and it was abuse. And he got defensive and said he didn't abuse me. He just made a decision for us that he thought would make us happy in the long run, and I told him he didn't get to make decisions about my body without my consent. I asked him how many pills he'd replaced and over what time period, and he admitted he'd been swapping out pills for about 3 months before I got pregnant, and I felt absolutely violated knowing that he'd been systematically sabotaging my birth control while pretending everything was normal and having sex with me under false pretenses. I told him I wanted him to leave immediately and that I was going to schedule an abortion and then figure out next steps, and he started begging me to reconsider, saying he made a mistake, but we could work through it and we could be a family, and I told him there was no working through this. What he did was unforgivable and our relationship was over. Brian refused to leave at first, saying it was his apartment too, and I couldn't just kick him out, but I told him if he didn't leave voluntarily, I would call the police and report what he'd done, and he finally packed a bag and went to stay with his brother. I called my best friend Sarah again and told her everything, and she came over immediately and helped me start documenting everything. We took photos of the tampered pill pack, and I wrote down exactly what Brian had admitted to doing, and Sarah said I should seriously consider pressing charges because what he did was reproductive coercion, which is a form of domestic violence in our state. I scheduled an abortion for the following week, which was the earliest I could get in. And those few days of being pregnant against my will while knowing my partner had deliberately trapped me were some of the worst days of my entire life. Brian kept texting and calling, trying to apologize and convince me to keep the pregnancy, and at one point he said he understood if I wanted to break up but couldn't, I at least have the baby and then he'd raise it as a single parent, and I told him no, I was not going through 9 months of pregnancy and childbirth for a child I never wanted, and that he created through deception and abuse. I went through with the abortion, and it was both physically and emotionally difficult, but I knew it was absolutely the right decision for me, and my friend Sarah came with me and supported me through the whole thing, and afterwards I just felt this overwhelming sense of relief mixed with anger and betrayal. I started looking into what legal options I had regarding what Brian had done, and I found out that reproductive coercion is recognized as domestic abuse in my state, but it's really hard to prove and prosecute, and the police told me that unless I had video evidence of him tampering with my pills or a written confession, it would be hard to build a case. I did have his verbal admission to me, but not recorded, and the tampered pills, which could potentially be tested, but might not definitively prove who tampered with them. And the lawyers I consulted said I could try to pursue charges, but it would be an uphill battle and very expensive with no guarantee of success. I decided not to pursue criminal charges in the end because I didn't have the emotional energy for a long legal battle, and I just wanted to move on with my life. But I did file a restraining order against Brian because he wouldn't stop contacting me trying to get me to talk to him, and the restraining order was granted based on the evidence of reproductive coercion and harassment. The whole experience completely changed how I view relationships and trust, because I never in a million years thought that someone I loved and who claimed to love me would violate me in such a fundamental way, and it made me realize that you can never really know what someone is capable of until they show you. I told my family what happened, and they were horrified and supportive. My parents said they'd never liked Brian much anyway, and they were glad I got away from him, and my sister said she wanted to go beat him up, which I appreciated even though I told her not to. Brian's family reached out to me at various points trying to defend him or minimize what he did. His mother actually called me and said that Brian had made a mistake, but he really loved me and wanted a family, and couldn't I forgive him, and I told her that tampering with someone's birth control isn't a mistake. It's a deliberate series of actions taken over months to violate someone's reproductive autonomy, and if she couldn't understand how serious that was, then we had nothing to discuss. Some of our mutual friends took his side or tried to stay neutral, saying that what he did was wrong, but maybe I was overreacting by ending the relationship and getting a restraining order, and I cut those people out of my life immediately because anyone who thinks reproductive coercion is something you can just work through isn't someone I want in my life. The hardest part has been dealing with the violation of trust and the feeling that my own body betrayed me, even though logically I know it wasn't my body's fault. It was Brian systematically sabotaging my birth control over months while I trusted him and thought we were on the same page about our child-free life. I've been in therapy working through the trauma of what happened, and my therapist has helped me understand that what Brian did was absolutely a form of abuse and assault, because he removed my ability to consent to unprotected sex by lying about my birth control being effective, which means every time we had sex during those months, he was essentially assaulting me under false pretenses. That realization was really hard to come to terms with because I'd been trying to minimize what happened in my own mind, telling myself it was just birth control tampering and not that serious, but it was that serious, and it did violate my fundamental rights to bodily autonomy and informed consent. I've also had to deal with people's reactions when I tell them what happened, because some people genuinely don't understand why it's such a big deal or they think I'm overreacting. And I've had to explain multiple times that this isn't about whether or not kids are good or whether I should want them. It's about someone deliberately violating my reproductive choices and taking away my agency over my own body and life. The child-free community has been incredibly supportive. I posted my story in some online forums, and the response was overwhelming, with so many people sharing similar experiences or expressing outrage on my behalf, and it helped me feel less alone and less crazy for being as upset as I was about what happened. I've also become much more cautious about dating and relationships. I now tell potential partners about what happened to me pretty early on because I want to make sure they understand how seriously I take my child-free status and how important bodily autonomy is to me. And I've had a few guys react poorly to hearing about it, which tells me everything I need to know about their character. It's been 8 months since everything happened, and I'm still processing the betrayal and working through trust issues, but I'm also relieved that I found out who Brian really was before I wasted any more years with him or before he could do something even worse. I think about what my life would be like now if I hadn't noticed the tampered pills or if I'd given in to his pressure to keep the pregnancy. And I'm so grateful that I stood firm in my decision and got out of that relationship even though it was incredibly hard. The experience has also made me more vocal about reproductive rights and coercion. I've shared my story publicly to raise awareness about how common this kind of abuse is and how it often goes unreported or unrecognized, and I've connected with organizations that work on reproductive justice issues. Brian has apparently moved on and is dating someone new according to mutual friends, and I genuinely hope he doesn't do to her what he did to me. But I also know that people who are willing to violate their partner's reproductive autonomy once are likely to do it again. So I worry about his new girlfriend even though I don't know her. I've thought about reaching out to warn her, but my therapist advised against it, saying that would just drag me back into Brian's orbit, and I need to focus on my own healing, so I've chosen to respect that advice, even though part of me feels guilty for not saying something. Looking back, I can see some red flags that I missed or ignored, like how Brian would sometimes make comments about how cute kids were or ask hypothetical questions about what we'd do if I accidentally got pregnant. And at the time, I thought he was just making conversation, but now I realize he was testing the waters and trying to gauge whether I might be open to changing my mind. The whole experience has taught me to trust my gut instincts more and to take people's words seriously when they tell me who they are. Because Brian told me he was child-free, but his actions showed me that he was willing to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted, and I should have paid more attention to those small inconsistencies. So what do you think? Did I handle this situation correctly? And what would you do if you found out your partner had tampered with your birth control to trap you into parenthood? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm still processing all of this and I'd love to hear different perspectives. And if this story opened your eyes to reproductive coercion, then please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we share important relationship stories like this every day. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.